Then I was fertilized and became wise. I truly grew and thrived. From a word to a word, I was led to a word. From a deed to a deed, I was led to a deed. The children of Europe, raised in her fire and fury, have a history unequaled. Nowhere has witnessed such depths of tragedy or heights of glory. Mimmersbrunner is dedicated to celebrating both Europe and her children, to stir the sacred waters that animate, and to bring the ancient ways back to the forefront of the European mind. Through our work, we wish to rekindle those ancient embers of the European fire, and to once again hold our ancestors and their deeds in the reverence they deserve. To know your ancestors is to know yourself. Good evening and welcome to Mimmersbrunner Live. And sorry I just shook the camera there. As always, thanks for joining us. We appreciate everybody turning up, and it makes these live streams worthwhile. Now, before we get to the main show tonight, which is going to be on votive offering, something very close to me, something that I practice myself often, and something that we're going to, as I explained in this, and I briefly touched on last time, we're going to be doing I suppose you could call it an event, where we're going to be handing out some hammers for free to groups all over the world, and we hope to encourage this ancient practice. So tonight we're going to be looking into its history a little bit, looking at some of the finds over the years, over the millennia, and also look into some of the meaning behind this, or what they could mean, because it was such a widespread practice that it obviously had many different meanings, many different ideas behind it. But before we do that, I just want to mention a couple of things. We're going to be moving these live streams to a monthly basis. Now, don't worry, I'm going to explain something in a minute we're going to have more content up because of this. At the moment, I don't feel that some of the live streams are up to the standard that I would like them to be. And I do feel that on a whole, they're bringing down the channel, some of the live streams. They're not reaching the standards that we set here at Mimmersbrunner. So a monthly basis would allow me to make sure I've got all the right information to do a proper and in-depth live stream. Because when you're doing these things, I know lots of things and I've read lots of things and I've got lots in this head, but as I get older, my memory's not as good. So a great example of this was when I was going to write a very simple article. I was in a rush. I need to get an article out, and I wanted to do a simple article about pygmies, actually, which was quite humorous, and it was going to be a bit of a humorous article. And when I reread what I thought I'd read many years ago, I realised that I'd misread it. So I didn't know actually. So then it put me in a position where I couldn't write this simple article. Now the article about, I ended up on a journey, rather than pygmies, I ended up on a journey following King Arthur and his speculative conquest of the North Pole. It was I really enjoyed it and spent hours and hours researching, but it ended up into a 2,000 plus word article, which something that started off, which I wanted to do a 400 word article. Now, I mentioned that little story there because when you're doing a live stream, I've got lots of ideas and I know what I'm talking about, but I have to back everything up. I have to remember, and I can't rely on my memory as much as I'd like. So I have to research, make sure. And in the process, sometimes I find new things, things I didn't know, which then alters the way the stream would be. And that's part of what Mimmersbrunner started out to be, actually, at the very beginning, was me showing my exploration of my faith and my history. I wanted to write it down just as much for me as anybody else, and that's how it started. So with the monthly schedule, I'll be able to do much more in depth and reach a level that I'm happy with, because that's important to me, that I produce content that I'm happy with, that I think is good enough for you folks, good enough for your time to come here and spend it with me like you are tonight. But I've got a few ideas of getting more content out and more interaction. Small videos like this, where I'm sitting here, I could do pretty easily and pretty fast. But I was wondering, and then I thought, well, then I've got to keep thinking of things to talk about and what's relevant and what's not. So I had the idea that what I'm going to start doing is asking people questions. I'll do a post about it on Twitter and Facebook, etc., where you can give me your questions. Now, we did a Q&A on a live stream, and that went down very well, but it was over 3 hours as I tried to answer everybody's questions. And because of these limitations, I found it difficult to give full answers to some of the questions, because I had so many to do. So many questions were coming in that I had to shorten some of these answers. Now, with a 10-15 minute video, I could probably answer these questions a lot more in depth. So I'm going to ask for your participation. I'm going to put some posts up probably tomorrow where I want some questions, and the best questions, or the questions that I think I can elaborate on better, I'll make short videos, and I would do that at least once a week. And I might do just thought videos where I have an idea or something like that. We're still going to be doing normal poetic videos, and they are being ramped up. We have 2 in the works at the moment. They're past. That means I've done my bit and I've passed them on to Riss and Hal. We also have 2 that I'm finishing up writing. One, which is going to be a votive offering, a poetic piece. It's actually going to be a poem. And hopefully some footage of me doing a votive offering alongside the poem. And they should be finished my end maybe this week, and I'll pass them on. So we're going to be trying to ramp up the poetic videos and get more of those out, because they've been a little bit lacking at the moment. But another thing is we don't do this as a living. We do this because we want to give information to our folk in many ways. And we've also set up a new channel, which we're going to be, hopefully, we're ramping that up. At the moment, we're hoping to post once every 2 weeks, and soon every week, and maybe even more as we try and get into a rhythm with that. So there's a lot going on, and we're just trying to structure ourselves. And I know we restructure a little bit often, but like I say, we've got busy lives. We're trying to just work these things in and try and get more content out and deal with you. But yeah, I want to mention those questions answered. If you've got any questions that you think would make a good short video with me answering or elaborating on, or just giving my thoughts. Obviously, there's many ideas around many things, so I'm not trying to claim superiority of knowledge here at all. But anything you're interested in, that you think I could make a decent small video like this, where I'm just sitting here talking to you, probably add a few images of the content matter, which won't be too hard. Please send them in, but I will make a post about this, so we can get to that. I'm also hoping to do more articles. I've had a bit of a because of all these things, like these live streams sometimes take 2-3 days of the time I have available, not like 2-3 days full-time job, but the time I have available, and that really eats up my time to get other things done, like articles and like poetic videos. So we're hoping to try and restructure ourselves a little bit, but it will result in more content, not less, and higher quality content overall. Now, another thing I'd like to mention is I'm sporting a long sleeve shirt of our new design. We have got a new t-shirt out there, so sorry for the little advert here, but I'll just put the slides up. I haven't put a new slide up, it's the same as I used last week, but just to give you a mention, this is to fund a camera, we hope, which will result in me being able to, at first, as I get used to it, probably just going to the woods and setting it up and seeing if I can get used to the camera and give some thoughts and maybe answer some of the questions in the woods, especially if they're appropriate. But as I get more used to using the camera that we hope we will be able to fund, I hope to visit sites There are many sites around the world, and I visit them around the UK, and I visit them anyway as part of my heathen practice. So taking the camera there and doing little videos on little areas around the country might be a good idea, and maybe even small documentaries at some point. But that might be a way off, as unless we can ship Riss over to help us, we might struggle with that one. But we'll see what we can do. And like I say, so this is just a very a simple way of us funding it. And as always, we don't use the big corporations. We use a local printer, a very high quality printer as well. We use high quality garments, organic. We try to do everything as best, as environmentally friendly as possible. Of course, there is always going to be an environmental impact on what we do as human beings. That's been the same since the beginning of time. There's a little note here on the votive offerings, actually. In Scotland at the moment, it's become the wishing tree, where they hammer coins in. I wish I'd have got an image of that. I forgot about it. And they normally do this on dead trees as part of a votive offering. You hammer a coin into a tree, normally by a well or a waterway, which we're going to talk about. Some people, a little bit stupid, are doing it into living trees, and obviously copper poisoning is a problem for trees, so they're asking people to stop doing it. But even if we did it in the proper context, that is, of a dead tree, a felled tree, by a waterway, it would still have an impact on the environment. So our impact on the environment has always been, and that's not an excuse for what we do, but it is what it is. So I just wanted to give a brief mention there to the shirt, as it will help us fund, and hopefully, as all of our funds, hopefully help us develop the channel even more into a bit of a wider variety of videos and styles. Now I'll go back to the camera for a few minutes. But yeah, so no, those things are out of the way. And I forgot to mention that obviously the intro music there is the talented Hallander. I forget to mention it every time, but that is an exceptionally talented guy, and I recommend everybody follow his channel. You can find it through our channel. It's linked in the description. It's linked on the side as a partner channel, or I'm not sure what they're called. So if you have got the time, please go over there and give him a sub and check out his mute work. It's all there and it's all for free. And it doesn't charge. You can give him a donation when you purchase the music, but you don't have to. Just so you know. Now before, just to set up the show a little bit, I want to talk about the project that we hope to be putting out there. Now on the side you'll see a slide, and I'll explain that in a second. Sorry, I'll just clear my throat. But this is a project, as I said, votive offerings are very important to me in my own personal practice, my own personal heathen practice. The reason being, as I'm going to show in the stream, that this practice has gone on since the dawn of man, as far back as we can see, as far back as we can remember, as far back as archaeological records would take us. And so I wanted to do something. I've wanted to do it for a while, and obviously some of you may know that I design and cast pendants, hammers specifically. At the moment, I've got a lot of designs coming up, but that's something for another time. So, working with a great group of heathens here in the UK, Folkish Odinism Dorset, they've got a Facebook page. I recommend that you check them out. I'm going to link one of their articles next week over at Mimmersbrunner. I'm going to put it up on Mimmersbrunner and link back to their blog site, which I recommend everybody take the time to check out themselves if they want to know more about heathen practices. And I'm going to link to an article about votive offering, something that they do called Beating the Bounds. As you can see in those photos there, this was something headed up by those guys over there in Dorset. They've decided to revive this tradition called Beating the Bounds. Now, it was a Christian tradition too, as many pagan traditions carried on into the Christian era, where they go around offering prayers in the Christian time, at the boundaries of the local constituency, the local parish council or area, whatever area it was, the boundaries of it, where they go and they beat the sticks on the floor, as you can see them there with their sticks very happily, having a lot of fun. And they would do this while saying a prayer. Now, we have this going back into pagan times, but I'm going to get to that towards the end when we go into meaning. But we want to try and revive these old traditions. And one of the ways of doing that is by giving votive offerings, offering thanks to the land, etc. Which, like I say, we will go into all of this in a bit more detail, but I just want to mention the project briefly. And there will be more. There will be an article from Folkish Odism Dorset that I'll put on our website, and I'll write an article too. We also have a poetic video, as I mentioned earlier, to try and get this going, because we want to encourage this behaviour. We want to encourage this ancient tradition. And as part of my effort to help with this encouragement, I'm going to be giving away several hammers. I'm thinking about 9 at the moment, but it may be more if we get more demand, to groups. Now, I'd rather it was groups than individuals. But if you are an individual and you've got a few friends and you want to take a few pictures of you doing this practice, and like I said, we're going to have more information on what we do and how we do it, and I'm going to give you lots of information tonight on how our ancestors may have done it and lots of things around it, so you can interpret it how you want and you can look into the areas that most suit what you believe it should be. But this is obviously a boundary aspect, claiming the land back for the gods, claiming back for the people. So I will be giving away hammers in that, and there'll be more information on this. And all I'm going to ask in return really is that people take photos and promote it themselves. I mean, I'm happy to share it too if they want me to. Obviously, people may have privacy, but as long as they're sharing it amongst their own groups and sharing and trying to invoke this practice in heathen communities around the world, then that's the point of what I want to do here. So this should be, like I said, there's going to be more information on it in the weeks to come. But as a start off to this information, we've got tonight's show. Now, tonight's show, like I say, I'm going to go through the history. But I'll just leave those pictures up for a bit because they're amazing. It just shows you this history that we've forgotten. It's long forgotten, even though it wasn't too long ago. We've recently had a lot of groups who have been doing charming of the plough recently as well, which is another ancient tradition. But we'll leave that for another time because we've been talking about votive offerings, although votive offerings are included in charming of the plough many times. Votive offerings, like I say, it was a standard practice, very much so. This is just a collage here, slide, just so a bit why I talk about just what is a votive offering? Some of you may be thinking. Well, like I say, they could be used in many ways. We're going to go through a few of them. But they were almost the standard practice of our ancestral worship, our ancestral spiritual lives in the past. They're normally items of high value or the best you can afford. Now, and I do mean the best you can afford generally, or items handcrafted, items specifically made for the purpose, like my hammer axes will be for this. But they could include even relatively minor items, especially in the cases of people that were in poverty. A loaf of bread has a lot of value to a family that has little food. So the votive offering would be contextual to your wealth. But that isn't to say you just give them any old tat. When I had a bigger garden and I'd grow food, I would take the best of my produce and offer it to the gods and goddesses and the ancestors and the spirits of the land. The best, not the worst, the juiciest tomato, the grandest pumpkin. Just as an offer of thanks for the produce that I've been given. These are normally historically, they can be found in many areas, but one of the most common places that votive offerings historically, archaeologically are found is in waterways. Whether it be river, lake, pond, pool, brook, stream, or bog, or marshlands. And as we will see as we go through the slides, immense effort involved in this. The waterways were exceptionally important. This links to the boundaries a little bit because obviously boundaries are generally mark a territory, but not always. This relates in my belief, but I'm not going to go into too much detail of it, of like the land essentially being the domain of the living, the waterways being the domain of the dead and the gods, the other world, transitional space, as it were. We can see this actually in the first churches and the first monasteries in the UK. They're generally on islands or places that are cut off from the land at different times of the year. And pools inland would be the living surrounding the dead. And remember, most of the megaliths, in fact, were surrounded by a ditch of water. It was bringing these two elements together, earth and land. Stonehenge was, all the big ones, pretty much all of them. I don't think I found one that didn't have a ditch around it that would have been at water level at the time. They're generally not now because the water table changes level. But at the time of their construction, there would have been water around them. Many are built on fenlands as well, on an island within it. This connection of the living and the dead, and like I say, with the islands, it's the opposite. This is why it's a very spiritual place. Many of these ancient monasteries and churches on islands are built on much older spiritual places. And obviously, as the landscape changes, some of these places might not look like they're in the middle of water anymore, but when they were built, they were. Like I say, it would be a very spiritual place because it would be the living surrounded by the dead. And in the instance of a pool or a lake or river, it's the dead surrounded by the living. Now, there's a lot more I could go into there, but that's just a little bit of context of my ideas on the waterways and why they were so special. It springs as well because they're a source. But that's just a little bit of the context, and there on that slide, you can see a few of the images that we're going to get into. Now here, we're going to do a little brief history. Many people will say that votive offerings started probably in the Neolithic, but I believe they started in the Mesolithic, and I'm not alone in this thought. The top left there, that is from a place, just let me get myself together here, Blickmead. Now what we've got to understand about the Mesolithic especially, it's pre-farming, it's a hunter-gatherer society. And as with the Neolithic, the later Neolithic, and even the later Bronze Age, etc., and Iron Age, many of the offerings would have been, they are organic, that is perishable. So whatever we can find from this time period is exceptionally important to our understandings of our ancestors and their practices. I said there in the top left, we have some microliths. They're mini flint tools that were very popular in the Mesolithic. They were very, the Mesolithic were great. The Mesolithic people, and by the way, most of these slides are going to relate to Britain because I'm British. And it's part of my history and my ancestry. But votive offerings occurred all over the world. And I recommend wherever you are in Europe that you look into them because you'll find lots of interesting things. I enjoy looking into it myself all over the world. But like I said, I've kept this primarily English, British. But I have jumped around a little bit. But they were excellent crafters of flint tools. As we got, which is a little lesson for you of technology and how it affects us. As we got better with metals, we still use flint tools, but they just became very crude. We got a lot worse. The skills were lost. But these microliths were found in a place called Blickmead. Blickmead is a spring, a natural spring and a waterway found within the Stonehenge complex, but it dates back much older. Probably around 6000 BC, probably the earliest finds there. And although they don't necessarily say that some of these microliths, they found thousands of them, and I mean thousands of these microliths placed around this. Some were definitely tools because we have evidence of massive feasts, massive gatherings at these places. For a time, from all over Britain, we have evidence of, there's a dog tooth that was there, which was found possibly the origin, by checking the isotopes in the teeth, they found that probably came from Scotland. So people were travelling a long distance to go to this place. It had a lot of special importance, and we'll look into why in a minute. But many of these were found, many of these microliths are unused and of exquisite quality. That is a classic sign of a votive offering. Votive offerings were not your everyday tool, the hammer that you'd used every week. They were brand new items, generally better than what you would use as a tool. Over carved, more work has gone into them. Needed. Actually, later at Blickmead, we find, I think from the Bronze Age or the Iron Age, I forget now, there was a knife put in there. I think it was a bronze knife. And it only had one rivet in the handle, meaning that it was never going to be used as a knife, as a tool. One rivet's not going to hold it together properly. It was made specifically for purpose, very ornate, but not practical. So that's just an example there from Blickmead. I haven't got a picture of, but changes. I mean, many people believe the Blickmead site as well is the reason Stonehenge might be where it is, because it dates back. It's the oldest. It's the oldest site that we found. I say there was massive gatherings there, just like the later Stonehenge. Blickmead's a very interesting little pool because it stays above freezing all year round. And I read a little article on this over at the website, where I talk about this and I try to bring the logical and the practical together. Because obviously I presumed, or had a little thought, an idea that maybe it was a goddess of spring that was involved in there, because spring would spring from the spring in that instance, because as anybody knows that does gardening, that a few fractions of a degrees higher in temperature, which it would be from the water around the spring, it would be the first place the shoots would bloom. So to our ancestors it would seem as spring was starting there. That's where spring developed and pushed out because of the temperature rise, and the water would never freeze, so we'd have special. Now in the article I talk about this because some people, you'll get the atheistic mind that will say, well look, it's just practical, there's no spiritual. But if we look at Roman practices, especially because we have a lot of writing where they looked within the land for the gods or goddesses that dwelled there, it would seem the obvious place where spring springs for a goddess of spring to dwell. We can mix the practical, but I'm not going to go into that too much. You can check it out in the article if you want. It's called Blickmead, something. Sorry, I haven't got the title with me. It also has a very interesting effect. You can see in the picture of the top right there. Flint left in it for a little bit because of a certain algae, a very rare algae that lives in the pool because of the temperature, the constant temperature. If you put flint or stone in there and then take it out, it becomes luminous pink. So there's another interesting little thing there which you could speculate on, but it's because of a certain algae, but obviously it gave even more. So these little microliths that you could put in, you could take them out and they would be pink, almost blessed by the goddess, right? So it's a beautiful place, and like I said, there was auroch bones there. Some of those could have been ritual deposits, animal bones, and even human bones, ritual deposits sometimes, maybe part of some kind of votive offering. In the bottom left there we have from Starcar up in the north. Beautiful site in the UK, a Mesolithic site. Now, there's a bit of controversy, no one really knows, but there is some academics at least, and myself as well, and I'm not an academic, believe that some of these possibly were votive offerings because of the certain placement to them. But obviously it's such an old site, the landscape has changed so much that it's very hard for us to tell, because we will have very little organic, and we're so blessed at Starcar to have what we have in the organic matter, such as bones. These ritual masks, as they've been called, carved out of red deer stag skulls. And there you can also see harpoons that we use for fishing. Now the community at Starcar live just up the way a little bit, But they found many things around the waterway, well, where the waterway would have been in the Mesolithic. It isn't there now. This was at a time when Britain was connected to Europe too. Some of the finds there can be even very similar. Like there is a shale pendant, which I didn't put up there because I don't know if it was a votive offering or not, which has some beautiful markings on it, actually similar to those beads which were also found at Starkar. Again, possible votive offerings. We can't be conclusive with it because of the date. So all I want to do here is establish with it, but Starkar as well. I mean, it is like I say, it's a great site, and we was connected to Europe. Some of the finds here are very similar to the finds that we find in Mesolithic Denmark, and this would make sense because we were completely connected to Denmark at that time. And our history with Denmark here on the British Isles goes back a long way. Not just to the Mesolithic, throughout the ages, we have very similar ideas on culture. This is one of my reasons why I don't worry about the difference between the Celts and the Germanics so much, because if we take even Celtic Britain and Denmark and we go through history, we find very similar practices, despite one being classed specifically Germanic and one being classed specifically German. The votive offerings, the styles, etc., very similar. Doesn't matter what time of period you go back to. Now, so this slide's just to show, and I just wanted to talk here about the very early, how far back this tradition goes, or possibly in this case, there's no confirmation of it. But like I say, given that the tools were not used in some cases, given the placement of these by waterways, an inlet from the sea in this case, it is very, very, very possible and very likely that these were part of votive offerings, as we see in the next slide here. Now, the Neolithic, there wasn't many slides to show you unless I wanted to show you a million pictures of polished axes. They're beautiful, but they wouldn't really work. And I see quickly here, there's a little comment about saying that is the Ogham inscription on those beads. I doubt it, BS, because Ogham comes thousands of years later. We're talking a Mesolithic here, around 8000 BC in the case of those beads. So about 10,000 years ago. But there is some speculation that it could be a writing system, especially if you go look at the shale pendant. Just type in Starkar, that's star as normal, car with 2 R's, and shale pendant, and you'll get some beautiful images of this pendant. And I agree that it does look like an inscription for sure, and it's very similar to that. But I mean, is it an early type of inscription? I don't know. I mean, it would be very hard for us to tell, but it's definitely possible, in my opinion, for sure. Now, back to the Neolithic here with this slide. Like I say, unless I showed you 100 polished axes, because obviously this was the polished axes, they could be practical use, hand axes, but of course, putting that effort into some of these stones, as we talked about in the Thor's Hammer stream, some of these stones, polished and carved to perfection, beautiful. And these were placed in waterways and rivers in large deposits in some cases. So we can now start to be certain that these were done for a spiritual or religious matter, because they start to appear in waterways all over the country and all over the world. To some extent, to a lesser extent, votive offerings are very, very prominent in the British Isles, going back very early. And these are beautiful constructions in massive amounts. The top left there is some heavily worn carvings that were found at Stonehenge, called the bird offerings or something, I'm not sure what. We don't get much, but that was left at Stonehenge, probably a votive offering because of its placement, its deliberate placement into the land through archaeological techniques. We can see when something's dug and put there. And this shows us again the water and the land aspect. They can be on land, in mounds, etc. But they're most commonly in waterways. That's a jadeite axe, by the way, that was found in the River Thames. It's Neolithic. Oh, and I forgot to mention with the Mesolithic, there is also evidence of, on the Thames actually, a platform very similar to votive offering platforms from the Neolithic and the Bronze Age. Although they've found no finds associated, we're amazed that we've even got the stumps of the platform. It's that old. But that also was found in the Thames. If you want to look up votive offerings, just look up the votive offerings found in the Thames. There's some absolutely stunning votive offerings there. And I've got a video that I've been working on. It'll probably go on the new channel, where I'll go through a little bit of this. It's a more poetic video and a defiant video. But that's a jadeite polished axe, beautiful. Like I say, many. And like I say, we're starting to see more of them in the time. We've got a farming communities developing. So we're probably going to see organic matter deposited that we've lost. Even under stones, in some of these stone circles, we find deposits. Maybe a skull, bones of some animal or hunted animal, or even in the case stones or white stones. And I'm going to talk about the white stones because they're a very interesting aspect of votive offerings. People ask about jadeite in the Thames. It's a jadeite axe in the Thames. I'm not sure where the jadeite came from, GC, but yes, it was found in the Thames. But it's not uncommon for things to travel long distances. We can tell by flint tools, actually, they're very good, especially polished axes. We find that some of the most beautiful places where they produce not just good flint, but beautiful flint, that can be found all over the country and even into Europe, where these objects are seen as having, because of the beauty associated with the look of the flint, are seen as exceptionally rare, exceptionally important. And they would have transported, especially these high quality objects, all over Europe, in fact. And we have it from Britain and Ireland going back to the Neolithic, where we see British flint in common use in certain Irish sites and vice versa. So where it came from exactly, I'm not sure. Crystal asked a little question about Ogham, and I will jump in and just answer a little bit about that. Some people do see Ogham as a runic cipher. Many academics actually see that as a runic cipher. In my research, there is some similarity. There was definitely a lot of communication going on between these two peoples. Many people don't realise that about 50% of it, or just under 50% of the genetics of Iceland, where we get most of our Norse texts, were Irish and British. So knowing that they had a big influence in each other, we know. I was doing a bit of research on the Chalki, the Germanic tribe, the most noble of Germans, and there's evidence that there's possibly a Chalki group living in Ireland in the Iron Age. So I would definitely say, even if they weren't related at the beginning, they definitely became related. And let's look at a little story. And sorry to go off on this little tangent, but it is an interesting one. Let's look at their origin story. The runes, as most of you here will know, come from Woden, or Odin, as many people call the deity. Woden hanging upon a tree, who was given the runes. I'll keep this short because it's a bit off topic, but well, how did we get Ogham? Ogham comes from Ogma, who got the runes from the rustling of the branches of the trees. So both of the scripts, both of these methods of language came from trees. And there are similarities between Ogma and Woden too. Maybe I'll do something about that. Maybe that's a good first question, Crystal, for a small video. Because I'd certainly like to know more too. Ogham is something that I've delved in a little bit, but not too much. Not as much as the runes, obviously. So it'd be interesting if I could do a bit of research on that and maybe make a short video on it. So thank you for that, Crystal. Crystal's a long-time supporter, and she does some great work as well. She makes some beautiful drinking horns. So I definitely recommend checking those out. And Crystal, feel free to do a link in the chat there of your work. I'm sure people appreciate it. I mean, beautiful. So she does other work too. But getting back on topic, sorry for that little divergence there, but it's an interesting subject, and this is what's beautiful about it when you start on a conversation about our ancestors, you could go off into many different ways. And that's the beauty of it. That's why I love talking. This is why when I get talking to people, I can talk for hours and hours and hours and not stop, because we go from one tangent to another tangent to another tangent, because it's just so fascinating. But back on script. So the Neolithic, we have the introduction of farming, but we see the ramping up, or some people may believe the beginning of votive offerings, but there's certainly votive offerings, like I say, we find massive hordes of them. It certainly was. Now, the next slide, we're going to go into the Bronze Age, where it really ramps up, and because they're metal, we find lots more of them. They last a little bit longer than the organic matters, because obviously alongside those polished axes, we would have had a ton of organic offerings, bones, antlers, but a lot of those are just going to disappear. It's very... I've said this before, but I will say it again. We're so lucky to have anything in this time. The conditions needed to preserve some of these things are almost like winning a lottery in some cases. So when we look at what we've got, when we start to look at what we've got, we must imagine thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe even a million more objects have lost to us, especially as we go far back in time. Completely gone now. So whatever we have, it's only a fraction of what there is, or what there was. And this is something... So when we find high amounts of things, we have to imagine that there were 10, 100 times more than that, even 1,000 times more than that. Now here, as we go into the Bronze Age, this is just... The scope of the Bronze Age is massive. Bronze Age axes, we have a horde there. I think it's a Havisham horde, but I will just quickly check with my notes here to make sure I am on the Havering horde. There you go, got it wrong. Got the first bit right. That's the Havering horde on the bottom right there. No, it's not actually. No, it is. It is the Havering horde. Sorry, getting a bit confused. And that's just showing you, I linked that picture just to show you the massive amounts that can be in one deposit. And that was of several deposits. That was one deposit, but there were several others within the local landscapes. So we're starting to see massive amounts. And these are all generally higher quality. When we compare some of the axe heads and the swords to those that we find in situ on sites, which is very rare, but we do find them, as we'll talk about in a second with flag fen, they're generally of a higher quality and never used. There is, in the middle, there's some swords there, both Bronze and Iron Age, although I'm talking about the Bronze Age here. I thought it was just good to show the comparison of the swords, actually. They're interesting in size and difference, but they were found at Flag Fen, which we're going to talk about in detail in a minute, but you see the exquisite nature. These are how beautifully crafted. This is the Bronze Age, when bronze is just becoming a thing, just becoming something that people are using. They've just developed the techniques and the exquisite nature. And these are putting these in to the waterways. They're giving them over. They're giving up their swords, or they're having specifically crafted swords for this purpose. On the far left there, we have a wooden ornament, which is very rare to find from the Bronze Age, just as before. And I put it up. It was found in the Somerset. I'm going to have to check my notes again. Somerset Levels, another low-lying area, Flag Fen, low-lying area. All of these places are found in marshy boglands. Seems to be a particular interesting place for the Bronze Age people, as in watery ways. And again, as I said earlier about the living and the dead, it's a place where the living and dead meet. We also have sacrifices, human sacrifices in these waterways. But before, I'll talk about them in a sec, but I just want to... The reason I put that little statuette there, this little Venus figure, if you like, is because I love its name, the God Dolly. It just amuses me. But I think it's a beautiful name, actually, and quite fitting. But as I said, human sacrifices even. Now, something I'd like to mention a little bit about human sacrifice. I have to do a show or maybe a little video on it at some point. Because in the Viking Age, there is some evidence of this, that people say that it was criminals and homosexuals that were put into these places. And that may be possible in the Iron Age. I have seen some evidence for it in the Viking Age and maybe the Iron Age, but before that it certainly was not. The people that we find in there, in my research, and this isn't about all of this, but I'm just going to go into it a little bit because it relates to the waterways that we're finding these pieces, are either people of very high status. I forgot what. I didn't mean to talk about this, so I haven't re-jogged my memory. But in Ireland, there was a find, and I forget where in Ireland, but they found. But this is just one example of many. A bog body, I think dating from the Bronze Age, possibly Iron Age. But this was a man of high status and high wealth because of the preservation of the bog bodies. And I mentioned this a little bit. The preservation is down to tannin, which is found in oaks. And there's a real. I really need to do more research on tannin. It's a very interesting chemical essentially, but natural chemical that will preserve things. But in the instance of these, because of the good preservation of the bodies, we can find that generally a lot of these people are not hard. They haven't got worn hands, soft hands. They're bigger than most people. They've had a very, very, very good diet. Sometimes their nipples are clipped. Now that's a sign of royalty, but we'll go into that another time. Like I say, I just want to touch on this. So we can safely assume some of these people were kings, and obviously we have this practice going on in Sweden in the Viking Age too, where a king sacrificed himself. But this is something that needs to be, because people just think it's bad people in the bog bodies. And the other instance, which is a little more macabre for somebody, a little bit of research I did, we find children, but in every instance that I found a child bog body, I found indications, looking at the archaeological records and the archaeological write-ups, indications that child was gravely ill or in immense pain from a terminal illness or a long-standing infection. And so I believe that the more wealthy people that would have been sacrificed at these places did so willingly and did so to give themselves to the gods and the goddesses. In the instance of the child sacrifices, I don't believe they were necessarily sacrifices. Given that the instance of nearly every case that I've looked at had indications of illness, it was almost a mercy killing and giving back maybe to the waterways to be reborn or to be in the care of the goddess, the genius of the land, the spirits of the land. I don't know, but a lot of people want to look at things in a very macabre way, but as in it was all bad and it was all brutal. But our people we are their blood of their blood. We have to look at it through our eyes, although tainted by the modern world. We can find instances where it's a little bit different. But there again, we have the connection of the spiritual and the living and the dead in these waterways. That's what I wanted to express there, because we're seeing, like I said, these bogs, especially in the Bronze Age. We have these beautiful constructions. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about Flag Fen, which is a massive site. Over 1 million timbers have actually been found at Flag Fen. If you check Wikipedia, it would say 60,000, but they're lying because the person that they source, I've read their book, and they say over 1 million, so they're sourcing it wrong. But which is not uncommon for Wikipedia. But over 1 million timbers are used in its construction. Maybe the 60,000 is related to the piles, possibly. The speculation on why this was created, you can see there the size of it as it goes into the island in the middle of the waterway. And all along that waterway, we see votive offerings. And at the edge, in the waterway, on the island, they're found across this thing. At first, people just think it's a bridge. But because of the mass of votive offerings, it looks. I believe there are some platforms there as well that are not in that image. But it's been a while since I looked in depth at Flag Fen. I'm working a little bit off memory here. The wood as well was, a lot of it was oak, especially in the piles, I believe, which is not natural to that area. So it was brought in, which obviously gives the idea that it could be spiritual. Just as we saw with Stonehenge, they were bringing in rocks from far distances. Same with these practices. There could have been a spiritual connection to the oak, which we know from later times, definitely, that they wanted to use oak specifically for this, despite them having to bring it from far away. But one of the things about Flag Fen, and that's Muss Farm in the top left, which is just to the south of Flag Fen, and probably where the people lived that built it. And it's check out Muss Farm. It's a beautifully preserved Bronze Age stilted habitat. They lived on stilts. They lived in the marshlands. People don't realise this. Craddocks, we called them. They're the type of house. And many of our ancestors lived. In some cases, we found as well, they lived above the waterway, running water. They would build their houses with the waterway running. So this connection to the waterways was not just spiritual. They wanted to live on it or live next to it. So it was a very powerful, place. We're going to get to this in the meaning a little bit more, but I wanted to show just how much effort. 1 million timbers, 60,000 piles, at a time when we are told life was very hard. Mostly a spiritual practice, given the fact that timbers come from. If they just wanted to build a bridge, they could have built a bridge. You could throw stones. It's a marshland, it's fens. You could throw stones in there and turn it. Pile in some very simple wooden planks. This is specifically constructed with masses of finds related to spiritual matter from all sorts. As we saw earlier, we saw a few of the swords there, axes, organic finds, even white stones, which we're going to get to in the next slide. But the reason, like I say, I want to show this because this is a monumental undertaking for people at this time. No cranes, no. They've got bronze tools, but that's it. And this is not the only one we found in marshlands. Somewhere in the north now, and I forgot where, but it was used for 10 years. There was a whole place, miles and miles of trackways going in all directions to the centre of this marshland. That was used for 10 years. Tens of thousands of trees felled to create a walkway that was going to be used for 10 years. And in the centre of this, all we find is all the walkways lead to the centre of the marsh. And just thousands of votive offerings. So people are undertaking massive tasks, massive undertakings to practice votive offerings. Exact meanings behind them, as I say, we'll look at that in a bit, but this is a massive undertaking, and I really want to stress that. We also, something I need to mention, especially in the Bronze Age, we start to see the breaking of some of the implements going in there. This has obviously been so instead of just putting in a sword, as it was, they would bend the sword and throw it in. They would make it unusable. There could be a spiritual context to this, and we will look at this a little bit more in the Iron Age, when I get to the Iron Age. But because obviously a symbolic death of, if you're passing something to the other world, maybe you kill it first, give it a symbolic death in this world to put into the next. And we know that they're deliberately broken. These aren't just throwing in broken tools that they've already used, because, for instance, with the blades are still sharp and unused, and they've been bent in such a manner that it was a deliberate. It wasn't. They didn't accidentally bend it and fold it 3 times, etc. So we know that these were deliberate acts by the people involved, and which would probably carry some significant meaning. But not all votive offerings were. and maybe there'd be a difference in what you're doing with that votive offering that will indicate whether you should break it or not break it. But yeah, so that's just it. And like I said, that's one of many. Flag Fen is a beautifully preserved one, but one of many that we find in Britain, where we have monumental undertakings in an effort to continue the practice of votive, to enhance the vote. Like I said, there's platforms we find going out as well. Platforms that don't go to the other side. They're not bridges. They're platforms that go out halfway, and around them we find votive offerings. And we even find platforms similar to this in the Mesolithic, although the votive offerings, possibly because they were more organic, are lost to us. So we're building, since Mesolithic times, possibly, but definitely Neolithic, we're building structures for this practice in our hard lives of farming and hunting. We're going out of our way to do this. And this is one of the reasons I find them so powerful, and I've been drawn to them so much. It was such a powerful symbol of our spiritual faith for our ancestors that I do believe it needs reviving. And we're going to go through the ages now a little bit, and like I say, we're going to carry on a little bit and show some things. But what I'm going to do now, because we're hitting about the hour mark, is just take a little break and check with my wingman wrist to make sure everything's going okay, because I know we had some audio issues. So I'm going to put a bit of a longer video on. I'm going to put Remembering. Now the reason I'm putting this up, because the ending of the video Remembering, and I know if you've watched it, go take your time to get a cup of tea yourself. But the ending of Remembering is something that we really want to remember as we get to the end of this, when we start talking about meaning. So I'm going to play that now for you guys, and I'm going to go grab a cup of tea. "1846 should have been a year of celebration for the Lamont family of Ballymoney, County Antrim. The family had been blessed with a new son, a certain William John Lamont. Although the small family had much to celebrate, their nation had just fallen into a devastating famine. Although I know little of William's life, I know a few years before his birth, a poorhouse was built in Ballymoney to aid those who had lost everything and were on the verge of starvation. If William was born to one of the families in this poorhouse or not, I do not know. Either way, he would have witnessed firsthand and almost certainly suffered in the Great Famine. At some point, he left Ireland and settled in Scotland. He passed at the young age of 34, most likely due to illness caused by poor nutrition in his youth. He had done enough, though, to secure his lineage, as William is my great-great-grandfather. At around the same time, a certain Timothy Clay first opened his eyes to this world, over the shores in England. His plight was not much different. The price of iron had dropped dramatically, and as a consequence, the local trade of nail-making had taken a dramatic turn for the worse. Poverty had struck the small nail-making communities of the Midlands. The nail-makers, now unable to make enough to eat, began to organise strikes. Civil disorder ensued, and local authorities even had to call upon military assistance to quell it. This didn't stop them, though. Strike after strike occurred, as no matter how hard they worked, no food could be put upon their tables. I know even less about the life of Timothy, but I do know his granddaughter, Amy Louisa Clay, was handed over to a poorhouse at birth, as her poor family was unable to support her. Amy was my great-great-grandmother, a staunch and noble lady, who by the grace of family memory, I heard many stories about, all lovingly told by my dear Nana. It is often claimed that the famine my great-great-grandfather suffered under was the fault of people like my great-great-grandmother. The snippet of history my family tree reveals, though, tells a slightly different story. The common Englishman, that is, the workers of mine and forge, did not benefit from the suffering of the Irish folk. They themselves were locked in their own battle for survival across the narrow sea. Few know that the Irish had suffered a food shortage in the late 1700s. You do not hear of this famine though, because there never was one. The ports of Ireland were closed. No food could leave the island. Thus, starvation of the population was averted by sound measure. This did not please the wealthy merchants, who got fat off of the hardships of the common man. In the Great Famine, the Great Genocide, and orchestrated land theft of the Irish peoples, no such measure was enacted. The merchants made their pretty pennies as the poor starved and were forced out of their homes. To gain access to the poorhouses set up to aid the starving, you could not own land. If you did, especially with valuable commodities like housing, you would also be forced to pay for the poorhouses via the poor tax. As you can imagine, this only exacerbated the problem, whilst driving a wedge between the folk. With tenants unable to pay, their houses, instead of being sources of income, became burdens for the landowners. As soon as they became empty, they were knocked down. With housing and land becoming too expensive to own, land prices dropped. This gave the super wealthy rich pickings, whilst the poor became totally dispossessed. Some tried to escape this ordeal by begging and borrowing to afford a ticket to the new world. For many, though, this would only end in further tragedy. Many unscrupulous merchants would take advantage by selling tickets at extortionate prices. This was not their worst crime, though. Some would even purchase boats in ill repair, take out high insurance on the vessel, with the full knowledge that these ships would never make it to their destination. Many of these coffin ships sank at sea, all souls aboard lost. How many died in such a way, no one knows. But again, the merchants made their wretched coin. Many may blame British rule for the situation, and to a point, I agree. But what of the common Englishman? What was his plight? The poor laws introduced in Ireland had already been in effect in England and Wales for some time. The workhouse was a common sight in English towns since the 17th century. A description by Sir Frederick Eden in 1797 gives us insight into their operation and conditions. The workhouse is an inconvenient building, with small windows, low rooms, and dark staircases. It is surrounded by a high wall that gives it the appearance of a prison and prevents the free circulation of air. There are 8 or 10 beds in each room, chiefly of flocks and consequently retentive of all scents and very productive of vermin. The passages are in great want of whitewashing. No regular account is kept of births and deaths, but when smallpox, measles, and malignant fevers make their appearance in the house, the mortality is very great. Of 131 inmates in the house, 60 are children. They were initially set up for the frail and young. Children were often sent alone, split from their parents, as was little Amy, my great-great-grandmother. With war and bad harvests ravaging England in the 1800s, demand became high. Able-bodied workers were not given access to them, nor wanted it if they could avoid it. Instead, certain amounts of relief were handed out to people not within their walls. This would all change, though, with an amendment to the Act in 1834. Despite the hardships of war and the crop failures, some accused the poor souls taking up this outdoor relief of abusing the system. Thus, with the amendment, this was stopped. To get any aid, you had to enter these prisons for the poor, and forsake both your free will and any property you owned. This was one of the main reasons for the separation of families. Parents would put their young in such institutions whilst they desperately searched for work, so they could bring them home. A home with food on the table, that is. Daily life in a workhouse was a grim ordeal too. They were only allowed to allot food to the inmates, no clothes or other essentials, and for this pitiful amount of grain were forced to work. Where no meaningful work could be found, they would be given tedious tasks, such as splitting rope, to earn their meagre rations. In Scotland today, there are many a wall built over mountaintop, serving no purpose. They were built to give these poor souls work to do, for fear a handful of oats would go to someone who was deemed lazy. Across the sea, as you might imagine, with the infrastructure already in place, when iron prices dropped, causing the now makers to be unable to make a living, many families, unable to put food on the table, ended up in these workhouses, losing all they had worked for over generations in the process. Their plight was already a hard one. Unable to sell their wares directly, they had to sell through Tommy shops. Effectively, they bartered their nails for goods, not money. The products on offer were normally of low quality and were priced much higher than in normal outlets. In vain they organised strikes and pleaded, but invariably the leaders of such actions were beaten and abused as a message to the others. With the strikes having no effect, this led many into generational poverty, never fully recovering from their losses. Thus, already with nothing, the plight of thousands of little Amy Clays was sealed long before their birth. Even through all this misery and heartache, they still soldiered on, never allowing this to break them. Amy grew to be strong and dignified. So too did little William. They forged their legacy, not in gold, but in something far more valuable: blood. I am here today as testament to their endurance, their tenacity. Which brings me to why I wrote this piece. This video is a little different from our normal fare, but to honour our ancestors, we must understand their plight. No one was there to comfort little Amy when she cried for her mother's touch. In fact, my Nana, who adored her grandmother so, never knew of her ordeal till I uncovered it. Amy grew to be a proud lady of noble nature, who would never deign to tell others of her hardships. As for young William, I often wonder how many times he kept quiet about the pains in his stomach from lack of food, knowing his loving parents could not answer his pleas. We cannot turn back the hands of time. We cannot undo what has been done. As much as we wish, we cannot be there to comfort them in their time of need. We can, however, remember them. The power of acknowledgement is underrated. To acknowledge another's deed or pain can create powerful bonds of attachment. This is just as true of the dead as it is of the living. When we remember, when we acknowledge our forebears' hardships and lives, we show we care. Our hands reach through time and lay themselves upon their shoulders and gently whisper, "It was not in vain." This can also have a profound effect upon our own lives. In remembering them, we acknowledge ourselves. I am often amazed at how so many of my people diminish the suffering of their own, falsely believing that their ancestors are the cause of all the ills of the world. When I hear a young European state, they hate white people, my heart breaks. Not just for them, but for those who went before. I do not know what happens in death, but I know In remembrance, all things live. To be forgotten, for your plight to go unacknowledged, must be the sharpest pain the dead can feel. To have your love reduced to an accusation of hatred must be like a second death. Although this piece speaks of my ancestry, I know that everyone listening to this has their own tales. Each and every one of you has 1,000 or more stories of your own. I urge you to uncover what you can, and whenever possible, remember them, acknowledge them, and give them the gift of life and love once more. Welcome back. And that was a little bit of a sad video, and I apologise for sharing it in this context, but the ending is important to what we will be talking about in a while. But towards the end of this stream. But and it is an important message. And actually, people have asked, and I didn't say there's a runic script there that says to know your past is to know yourself, which is in keeping with that. But we're going to understand a bit. Back to the slides, though, so we can get through this. And I'm going to apologise again to especially our Europeans like me for such a late time. Just a message of a friend about it. But we do generally intend to come up earlier, but we're always behind and we're rushing around and we're still not quite used to it. That's one of the reasons for putting them at a month instead of every week, so we can get it together a little bit better. Like I say, and remember that I will put up some posts about questions to do short little videos, get them up once or maybe more a week. So please, if you've got any, remember to hold those thoughts and put them up when I put the posts, and I'll definitely try and get to them. Now back to the slides. We were at Flag Fen. Now, I want to talk about something that is found throughout the ages. They were found at Flag Fen, and it's white stones. Now, the white stones part, I need to look at my notes here because there's a quote that I need. But white stones are something that are found alongside votive offerings, generally in high quantity, and we can especially, although white stones and white pebbles are found all over the country. In certain places they're not, so we can tell then specifically, or the quantity of them, that these are definitely put there deliberately. We find this at Flag Fen. We find it's something I want to do a big compilation of, actually, because it's something that's rarely talked about, the white stones. And it's something that I've found evidence for in many sites. I've had to dig through the archaeological reports to find it, because they're normally listed as very insignificant in many cases. There are places where they are listed significantly. And that is, there we have in the bottom left, we have a picture of a Roman altar. Now, not only were Roman altars white, generally marble, but underneath them, the ground underneath the altars was generally, well, always, either crushed chalk or quartz or some other white stone, marble. And they were very specific about this, building their altars upon white stones. So we get an indication there that there is some importance to the white stone. Many sites in the UK, nearly all of them, you'll find are built on chalk. Many of the spiritual sites are built on chalk plains. Again, white stones. There's a picture of the Uffington White Horse carved into the land where you can see the bright chalk. Even hill forts, which some people, they weren't necessarily militaristic and probably had some spiritual practice too. Today they look like beauty. They almost blend into the landscape because the grass has grown over them, and they're beautiful. I mean, they're absolutely stunning to look at in this country. But most of them were white. They would have had white stones all around them. And there in the bottom corner, I've showed an interesting Shinto practice in Japan, where they write wishes onto white stones and put them in. Now, when I do my own personal votive offerings, I always wrap. So, if I'm taking a pendant, I will wrap it around a white stone, which I have here, like that, and I will throw it in like that. But we'll talk about that a little bit more at the end of the show. But that's how I do my votive offerings. The white stone is something that has been very important to me. There's a lot of interesting connections with the white stone as well. In the Roman times, we have an accomplished gladiator when he'd won his freedom, or a renowned title. He would be given a new name and given a white stone along with that name, with his name on it. We actually find very similar things in the Bible, interestingly, to the Roman practice of the gladiators, where I'll quote it. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who is victorious, I will give some of the hidden manna. The one who is victorious. So we have this. We have an earlier Roman practice than Christianity, just that I've been known, of giving a victorious gladiator a white stone with a new name. So let's reread that. To the one who is victorious, I will give some of the hidden manna. I will also give that person a white stone with a new name written on it, known only to the one who receives it. Identical practice to the earlier Roman practice of giving a white stone to a gladiator. Although this is in the Bible and it's connected to a spiritual connection there, and this is not my promotion of the Bible, I'm showing that we have clear earlier evidence of Roman practices of something that's identical in the later Bible. This is interesting for me. We also have, but I didn't have time. I was a little bit rushed this evening. In Hindu texts, I have seen it quoted that they say that to communicate with the dead, carry a white stone or quartz, as if you want to ask for something, they cannot resist it. I'm not sure if that is the Egyptian Book of the Dead or the Hindu, but in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, we also have something, but I need to verify this. I've read it a few places, but I need to verify it, so don't take my word for it. We have a similar text where they cannot resist, that the dead cannot resist, or the gods and goddesses cannot resist the white stone. Thus, if you ask for something, they will grant it. And I think it was the Hindu text that if you want to speak to your ancestors, essentially use a white stone. Yes, white quartz or chalk, but I think these are specific mentioning quartz, but it's more detailed. So we have this massive spiritual connection to white stone. It appears to be a communication with the gods, goddesses, and the dead, our ancestors. Like I say, Roman altars have white stones underneath them, the foundations. These are not going to be seen. These are the foundations. They dig. In fact, it's one way you can tell, archaeologically, you can tell you found a Roman temple, because there'll be a square cut out filled with white stone, and you know that's where the altar was. That's how common it is. It's an indicator that you found a Roman temple. You know this building is a temple, and you know that is exactly where the altar was, because of this foundation. So, and like I say, I can trace this back. I found it in sites, in looking at the archaeological reports, in sites in Scotland in the Neolithic, under stones. We find it in early Christianity, or Celtic Christianity specifically, and that would make sense because it comes out of Roman times. The earliest British churches that are coming over from Ireland after the Romans leave, on the islands out there, at the Isle of Man, we find at the altar end white stones put down, almost as if they're wishes, almost as if they're thanks or gratitude. It's a communication, in my belief. It's a communication with the ancestry. So I don't think it would have been used all the time, but if you want to send a specific message to an ancestor or god or goddess, maybe a white stone accompanying your votive offering would have been important. Like I say, if you want to talk, if we go over to the ancient Egyptians, we were talking about the hill forts being white. Well, so were the pyramids; they were bright white. This white nature, I said, like in the British Isles, nearly all the sites that I've looked at that have a spiritual or religious significance are built upon chalk flats. I mean, there are a lot of them in the UK. The wolds, for essential waterways, chalk waterways, were exceptionally rich in finds. Because obviously you've got the waterway running over chalk there, so you've got a very, very special connection. You've almost got a natural communication, a natural place of communication with the dead, and that's what we're trying to talk about here when you build upon these sites. Now, that's just my theories. I'm no academic and I'm no expert. I'm just a guy that's interested in his ancestors and interested in the past. And it's something that I've noticed. On a little side note here, something that I've done since I was younger as well. This is why it intrigued me so much. I had one stone that I carried for about 13, 14 years. Always. And this was a time when I was not spiritual at all. Time when I was going out. I remember if I used to get too drunk in my youth, I'd wake up and the first thing I do is check my jeans to make sure my white stone was there. My white piece of quartz. I had no idea why I did this. I just liked the piece of quartz. I found it in a stream in Wales. And I was just so taken with it. And the reason I have a white stone there is because I have lots of white stones here that I collect. This was a big piece of quartz from my local woods. I also have some flints here, which I should have showed you. Found these at the Devil's Arrows up in the north there. It's got percussion damage, so that's probably a piece of worked flint. A little blade, probably Neolithic by the size of it. I also found that, but if it is anything, it's the back end of something. There's no blade on that. But I have lots of random things over here in what is a makeshift altar. But yeah, I just wanted to mention the white stones because they're very important to my practice personally, and I have found them in others, and that's one of the reasons why I want to fund that camera as well. So when I go to places like the Devil's Arrows, I can do small videos on places like that and show some of the beautiful ancient monuments in this that country that people probably go past every day and know little about. So that's a good reason for that. But no, so we'll move on. But the white stones are very integral. We might touch on them a little bit later. We're going to the Iron Age now, and obviously we're starting to see, as our metalworking skills are getting better, as our smelting techniques are getting better, our casting techniques are getting better, we're starting to see what we recognize as truly beautiful artifacts. Someone's saying about flint being whitish or greyish. Actually, flint comes in all colours. And there's beautiful. As I said earlier about some of you might have black flint that's like a jet black and etc. These things would be traded more. It depends on the local. Flint comes in all manner of. Depends on where you live. And some of the white chalky stuff isn't in fact flint, but I forget what it's called. But it is used as flint, although it's not actually technically flint. But then we're getting into a depth of complexity that I don't know enough about to talk about. But yes, so as we go into the Iron Age, we're starting to see the absolute magnificence. And remember, the offerings earlier were just as equally as magnificent for their time. But this shows us the real greatness. All of these were found as votive offerings in waterways. They're one of the first ones out of the UK. We've got there the Gunderstrup Cauldron, a beautiful cauldron. It's enchanted me since the first time I saw it. Up there in the old Kimbri marching grounds, Himmerland, I believe, or around that area. And Himmer is Kimmer, which is interesting with the Germanic Celtic connection because the replacement of the H, the replacement of a C to a H, so instead of Kim, him, is actually a Germanic transition from a Celtic one. Make of that what you will. So it would have been called Kimmerland or Kimbriland. But it's an absolutely exquisite find. And we get mention of this in not this specific one, but we get mention of what these were used for, and they were used in ritual practice, probably ritual sacrifice of enemies, where then the Vates would read the blood of their enemies, maybe predicting their future or their past or their strengths or their weaknesses. I don't know. We don't get any information on that. And they would, the blood would go into the cauldron such as this. We also get evidence of it as in the Cimbri actually offered the Romans a gift of this at some point later. Offer them a cauldron. In the bottom left there. Oh God, I've lost my place completely here. That's obviously the Badsi shield. Votive offering again. Somebody built that beautiful shield. It's made of bronze. This is the Iron Age. It's probably not the best shield. It's not the best practical shield. It was made for beauty. It was made as an adornment to a king. Much like in modern ages, our king and queens wear regalia. There's no real practical use, but just shows their splendid nature. Or the splendid nature they should have if they were true noble. But they're not now, but we can delve into that another time. Maybe when I talk about nobility. But they were adorning the gods with beautiful gods, goddesses, and maybe even ancestors with a beautiful spirits of the lands. Beautiful adornments. Showing their appreciation and love for them. In the top right, of course, we have some of the Ikenai or Iceni. Depends on how you want to pronounce it. We have some of the talks found there because it wasn't just one. There were, I think, over 100 talks found. We'll get to that in just a second, but bottom right, that's in Anglesey. Absolutely loads of finds found in Anglesey. Anglesey was an island, a very spiritual place. We know this from the Romans. The Romans pushed the Druids to there. And it was called the Isle of Man. Manus. Interesting. But maybe that's for another show. But Anglesey is beautiful. There are so many votive offerings there, but that's just one that I found particularly stunning. Something I've been looking at a lot because I was trying to carve one the other day, but I got a bit eager and broke it. But going back to the Ikenai, I just wanted to mention that they're seen as hordes, people hiding them. Now, this could be true, and this is something that we do, especially on land. We see them as hordes in a lot of cases. I don't necessarily believe this is true all the time. From a friend of a friend who went there, found lots of white pebbles in the area that they were found, water, wash pebbles. He even brought some back. But that by and by of that, so people believe that they put them in there to come back for them at another time. Well, interestingly, the talks, they're all found in a vicinity that's got a boundary around it, a Roman boundary. They call it a Roman boundary because that's the earliest dating evidence they found within the boundary, cutting out sections. Somebody's asked me to define votive. I did at the start, but a votive just means it's something that you're giving and you're not expecting it back. It's given away for a religious purpose, essentially. You're giving it over to something and you're putting it there. You're not coming back for it. Yeah. So the difference with these hordes, an offering to a god, a goddess, a spirit, a genius of the land. Many. We're going to get to the meaning as we go. As as we get towards the end. But so some people consider them hoards. There's somebody who's going to come back for them, which then would make them a votive offering, as I just said. But in my opinion, because of this boundary that the earliest dating evidence they found is Roman, but remember they've only cut sections, they haven't dug it all. Most likely, in my opinion, you could probably push it back a few years there, and you would end up with. But they don't know why this boundary was built. There doesn't seem to be anything in it. This, for me, would signify a spiritual area. Another idea that says that they're hoards, and this is something that's often found in these types of sites, is they find the metal that made them. They also find completed talks and broken talks all in the same pit. Now, what the atheist mind sees there, they go, oh, well, it's a jeweler making these. Look, he's put some that he's made, he's put the materials he needs, and he's put a broken one that he's going to smelt down and make into a new one. But from the spiritual aspect, like me, I see, hold on, we've got a whole process of life and death. We have the bars of which they are crafted. We have the completed version. And we have a broken version, symbolically dead. So whilst most archaeologists consider that this is some kind of hoard that somebody's going to come back for me, I can very much easily see a votive, a spiritual essence to it. And I wanted to bring that up because, as I said earlier, we have the broken ones. And it's just something that I think about, and like I say, people just want to call them hoards as if our ancestors were just sticking them there and they're going to come back for them. There were several pits in this place, and possibly even more if people looked. So, yeah, that's about it on that. But sorry, my mind went blank. That sometimes happens on live streams, by the way, and I'm sorry about that. Your brain plays a bit of tricks on you. But again, I want to emphasise here the absolute exquisite nature of these finds. And these are given away. There's nothing was come back for with these, especially the ones like the Basu Shield. I mean, there's so many from the Bronze Age, especially in Britain. We struggled to think of which pictures. I had too many. Which pictures to use. I picked those because I want to mention a few things about some things now as we get into the tying up of this. Oops. And that is the tying up of this. Well, to a point, I forgot to add Anglo-Saxon ones, and shame on me for that because we were rushed. We got these. I put wrists under a little bit of pressure, and we got these in about 2 minutes before the show started. So we probably wouldn't have been able to do the Anglo-Saxon ones anyway. But we have the same with the Anglo-Saxon period. We have swords, all manner of things still thrown into the rivers. We have it also from the Vikings that are coming over in the Great Heathen Army. In the Thames too, we have swords put in there from both sides. Now that's interesting. Both sides trying to win favour with the spirits of the land, maybe. Especially in London because there's lots of battles over there. But so now we're going to start going into. I'll leave that up because they're so beautiful, much prettier than just my ugly mug. So I'll leave those up as we go into some of the ideas behind the meaning. Now, I'd like to disclaimer here, as I do in a lot of shows. I'm not an expert. I have opinions and ideas, and you may too have too. And all I wish to do is share my opinions, share my ideas. And you can take them, leave them, use them, or whatever. It doesn't matter. And my main goal, as always, is to inspire you to think for yourself about these things. To come away from this show and have a little think or ponder before you go to sleep, or when you're at work, or you're doing a mundane task on the magnificence of the finds, what they mean, and or the effort that your ancestors put into them. But we're going to look at a few reasons, and remember, this is such a widespread practice too, that it's definitely not one reason. There's not the votive offering doesn't have one meaning. It's so widespread, and there's so many different artifacts and so many different objects involved that we have to consider. And when we get to Roman times, which I didn't cover there either, but it gets a little bit commercial in Roman times. But we have all sorts of little effigies of gods and god. We have everything. And actually, I didn't mention Christian times either, which I'll just briefly mention. Now, Christian shows us a very interesting change in the European mind. We see that votive offerings get very specific. Votive offerings in Christian times are always generally to do with illness or favour. So if they've got a bad leg, they were literally throwing a pendant of a leg. And these were sold generally at the site, very much similar to the Roman times when they would sell these at holy sites, sold as tokens to throw into the water, as if it became a bit of commercial. That was the same with Christianity, because in certain places where we find these, we just find 100 of the same leg that was brought off probably a local person that you've got a gammy leg or a bit of a damaged leg, you'll throw it in and ask for help. And we're going to get into that a bit as one of the reasons, but we're going to look at other reasons why votive offerings may be given and why I personally use them and what I personally do with them. As I said before, when we looked at flag fair, this is immense effort. This, as I say, it's going to span spiritual degrees. We're going to have a lot of different ideas around them, and we've got to realise just the importance of this to our ancestors throughout history. Something that we stopped, and that's the point of this. The main point of this stream is to start the promotion of what I'm going to be doing with the Votive Offering Project, along with Folkish Odinism Dorset. Now, one of the reasons, as we mentioned at the very beginning, boundaries. Boundaries are exceptionally important to our ancestors, more so than we really realise. There are modern notions, as Gary puts forward in his article that I'm going to show, of boundaries and borders being bad things and evil things in the modern world. But boundaries were exceptionally important. As I said, the water-land boundary, living and the dead, the boundary between your territory and another territory, the boundary between the spiritual and the physical. All these boundaries, we have gods of boundaries, Terminus, Hermes stones that were boundaries. We find pots generally that would be filled with gold. These are on boundaries, so they have a little pot, and you give that as a votive offering to the god on your way when you cross into a new territory, a new place. So you have the idea of boundaries, which is an idea that Folkish Odinism Dorset are bringing to life with their beating of the bounds. This is marking the territory of your people, your folk, your genetic, marking it, giving honour to it, respecting it. Even in Christian times, they would say prayers at these boundaries, whereas in ancient times they would have done prayers to the gods or goddesses, or like I said, the genius or the spirit of the land, the god, the spirit that lived within the waters, or the land, or the mound even. An ancient ancestor, you may go offer them something because they were ancient rulers of this land, and you want to be healthy within that land, so you have to respect that land. And this also expresses itself as a respect for nature in general. Knowing that there is a living element to it, and respecting that element to it. And also, as we talked about with the Four's hammers a little bit, Four is often marked in boundaries because you want to ordain this land as yours, and ordain it as away from the wild place, as safe. You want Four's protection at that boundary from enemies or wild beasts. Yeah. So there's those ideas, and as Gary points out in his article, which will be linked in the week sometime, this beating of the bounds goes back. We have Roman accounts of it with the god Terminus, like I said, Celtic accounts of it from the Romans who mention it. And he writes a really great little piece in the article as well about a priest or a religious clergyman after the heathen army come back over and try to re-establish heathen practices for a little while before they convert too. In York, where the clergyman describes that they got the children to go around the edges of the territory and mark it with demon signs, which, as Gary rightly points out, is probably runes. So there, doing runes around the boundaries of the site. They're reclaiming the land in the name of their gods and goddesses, etc. Waterways as well as also often boundaries. As I said, boundaries of the living and the dead, but not just that, physical boundaries. In fact, in Roman times and earlier, we find a lot of these, like at Flagfen. Bridges become not just crossing to one piece of land to another, but become spiritual dimensions. As in, we find many votive offerings around bridges. Because you're travelling into a new area, so the votive offering could be to the new spirits of the land, that you offer, that you come in peace, that you want safe passage, safe travel. So this could be you asking for things. Or it could be to respect that boundary, as Gary's doing with Focus Yogism Dorset. They're going there to honour that boundary. Give thanks to it. But we're going to get into these in a little bit more detail. But so boundaries are definitely important in votive offerings. But not always the case. Like I say, votive offerings can be made in pools that are well within your territory. But boundaries are very important. And definitely one way that votive offerings were very significantly used. This leads us a little bit to sovereignty, which I want to touch on a little bit individually, because most of us have heard the story of King Arthur, right? And he throws his sword into the lake. Clearly, we know that our ancestors were throwing swords into lakes. So is that a votive offering? Now, the interesting aspect with that is that sword is sovereignty, King of England, right? King of Britain. Whoever holds that sword is the King of Britain. Yeah, whoever can pull it from the stone. Now, that in itself may be a little riddle in a way. The whole story, actually, the King Arthur story as it presents us, could be a little riddle. Well, not a riddle, but a little telling us about the histories. The first casts that were made for swords and metal objects in general were made in stone. So a man pulling a sword out of a stone might seem odd unless the cast that he poured the metal into was a stone cast. Then a man pulling a sword out of a stone, and if we have to use our imaginations here, but we could say maybe there's a certain cast that has been used for many years, that when a new king comes about, he has a new sword cast in the image of the old ones, in that same ancient cast. And pulling that out would then be a symbolic, as he pulls that sword out of the cast, it's symbolically that now he has taken sovereignty. Sovereignty as well with the water spirits, the lakes, as I say, the Lady of the Lake. This goes back to the harmony, the marriage of man and land. The Lady of the Lake, female spirits are generally always feminine. And if they mark the boundaries of your territory, it would be that they would be the rulers of that territory in the spiritual domain. The man is the king is the ruler in the physical domain, and that marriage brings harmony, brings a good crop, brings intention to the land. Now, this is an odd subject, and it goes a little bit out there for some people, but I want to mention that there are some big companies that use people that go to land and intend upon it. So if you want to grow if you want to grow carrots, you intend, you tell the land what you want, and big companies use some of these guys. Multi-million pound companies use these. Some of them anyway use these guys for this, and they apparently experience increasing crops or whatever it is they're doing. Now, I think this is an abuse of this idea, because we're the eyes of them and they're the eyes of us in both worlds. But what I'm saying is that there may be something in it. I'm not saying there is, and I'm not saying there isn't. Maybe it's something I can look into in a future video. But we get similar ideas of this as sovereignty of the land and the feminine nature of it with, for example, Niall of the Nine Hostages, the O'Neill clan, head of the O'Neill clan or O'Neill clan in Ireland. There's a part of his story which, in my interpretation anyway, would show this same sovereign nature. Niall and his brothers are, I think they're in a marshy land, but I can't remember. I haven't read the story for a while. Like I say, I can't always trust my memory. But they're in a marshy, wooded area, and they meet an old hag. Yeah? And she asks for a kiss. And nobody wants to do it except Niall. He kisses the lady, and she turns then into a beautiful woman. And then she promises him sovereignty for so many generations. She promised him rulership, that his genetics will rule for so many rulerships. Now, it seems like kind of an obscure story. But, like, who is she? Well, she must be the sovereign of the land, the feminine energy, the genius, the spirit of the land. And she's giving consent because he kissed her, and then he turned her into a beautiful lady. This could be a metaphor, if you will, for what O'Neill did, for what Niall did for the land of Ireland. Maybe it was in disrepair, we don't know. Maybe there was a famine or war. And he brought peace, so he restored the land had become battered and old, and he restored its beauty with a kiss, which we would interpret with his love for his folk, with his love for the land. He was a true noble in that respect. So through his love for his people and the land, he restored the land to its former beauty. And because of that, the land gave him sovereignty for many generations to come in his lineage. Like I say, this relates to the marriage of man and the land. I talk about this in one of our... I think I talk about it Come Home. I do a little hint at this. So there's another way, and obviously again with river crossings, the boundaries, so one spirit of the land to another spirit of the land. The mother goddess for the land, the mother people, because you feed off her, you feed off the land. And this could even relate to the sacrifice of human sacrifices that were intentional, willing human sacrifices to give blood to nourish the land. It's a feedback loop. To understand this, if you eat locally and you are born and you live in the place that you live, the bones and the blood of your ancestors has fed the soil, which then feeds the crops, which feeds you, and then you will die and feed the land. And it's a cycle. You and the land become one, a union, a holy union, a divine union. And this is why boundaries are very important. But we can lose sight of this, like we've lost sight of many things in the modern age. We see everything as superficial, without meaning. In the poem that I'm going to write about it, the ideas that I have for it are just the fact that so many walk past these riverways, walk past this divine, because their minds are with abstractions of what they want or what they desire, these physical elements. Where our ancestors' minds were very much within that divine element. They were almost seeing through the veils. And this is one of the objects of giving these gifts, right? You're showing a power over this. But we're going to talk about that in a minute. Only a few minutes now, I'm not far off. I know it's been a long stream and I do apologise, but there's been a lot to get through. Requests. As I said earlier, with the kind of requests for health, as the Christians did, it seemed to be very common with the Christian era requests, to ask for something of great importance, and to give something for that, either as payment for it after the fact, or as payment for it beforehand. It just depends how you want to look at it. I think both were probably... I think we have an example of... a possible example of this, and what I want to move into now, the last part, is gratitude. The Cimbri, although in some Roman writers they try to accuse them of being robbers and thieves, they note that after battles they would take all of the wealth, all the metal wealth, the swords, the shields from the Roman armies that they defeated. Remember, they defeated some very wealthy soldiers. Back then, the Roman army was primarily comprised of elites. They brought their own equipment, so some of it was very heavily adorned. So we're talking about a great wealth. And they took all of this, and the Romans say they threw it into the river. And they burnt what could be burnt and threw what couldn't be burnt into the riverways. And they say they do this as thanks. to the gods, goddesses, all the spirits of the land for their victory. Now, they would have probably asked for victory beforehand, so they payment for that victory. They have won, so here's your payment. Here's the bounty of our war. You give us victory, we give you the bounty. So there could be an element of that. It's a thanks, a gratitude for what you have. And there is always something to be thankful for if you're healthy and have a loving family and a roof over your head and food in your belly. So gratitude for me is what I primarily use votive offerings for. To thank the land, to thank the river, to thank the spirits within it, the gods, the goddesses, for what I have, for my health, etc., and things like that. And it's like I say, I was talking to Hallinder actually, and I've had this from a few other people, where they talk about it kind of feels strange. And this is something that I've noticed. You can do this, just play a trick on a friend if you buy a waterway. Say, throw in £10, just throw £10 in there. And if you can do it, and you'll have a problem with it too, when you try to do it, just throw some money into a piece of water. And let it float away. You'll feel a resistance, especially the friend that you're talking to if they've never done it before. You'll feel a resistance. You won't want to do it. There'll be a part of you that will go, well, this is, what am I doing? It's stupid. And this is showing the power that piece of paper has over you. So at least in early instances, I think, in the modern age anyway, like the Kimberley did in ancient times, they showed that they were very much in line with the divine, and they were not doing this for wealth. They were being honest in their intentions. They asked for victory for the survival of their folk, not to get wealthy. So therefore the wealth is of no need to them. So they give it over to the gods and goddesses. But in the modern age, this has specific importance, because it shows us the power that the material world has over us. But as we get used to it in the divine, we can break away from that power. And as you do more votive offerings, you'll have no problem. You'll be happy, because we've lost the idea of gratitude. And the reason I linked that video earlier about remembering is because who doesn't want to be acknowledged? Acknowledgement is such a powerful, and I mentioned it before, and I've mentioned gratitude before, but really people don't understand the power of it. We all know how it feels when we've done something in the background. We haven't said anything. We haven't boasted. And we're not bothered. We do it because we want to do it. We want to help somebody, or we want to do something, help our family. But we know how it feels when somebody spots it. Somebody sees what we did, even though we made no show of it. And they just come over and go, I saw what you did. Thank you. We can do this in our general lives. I talked about gratitude before. Tip the guy that you see that you get your vegetables off sometime. Let him keep the change. When you get your hair cut, just say, yeah, keep the change, doesn't matter. Give gratitude. And that small appreciation, it could be £1, $1. It could be something tiny. But people react to you differently. And the same principles apply. This land now forgotten, the holiness, the sacredness of the land, of the waterways is completely forgotten. People walk past, like I say, the riverways. It's only the children really that remember. The children that are fascinated with their fresh eyes. When we get around something for so long, we forget to see it. We don't see it. I've been to places before and I've gone, oh, that shop down there where I've never been before and a friend lives. And they're like, what shop? They've lived there so long they forgot to look anymore. They didn't know it was there. But my fresh eyes saw it, and this is the same with the chart. Their fresh eyes sees the magic and the power and things that we've become accustomed to and lost our sight. Our ancestors tried to keep that sight alive. And one way we know this is the practice that we have today. The last great practice of votive offerings in the world today. We still do it. We've just forgotten. And we think it's child's folly. The wishing well. I think everybody here has probably thrown Kohen into a well, a spring, which is a very common place for ancient votive offerings. The source of the well, the purest of the water, that's come from the womb of the land. In our modern age, we don't think it works. And our children have lofty plans as children. We dream of big things. But just as I said in an article I wrote, what harm would it do to throw your coin in just to say thank you, even if it's just for the smiles on the children's faces and the hope. But it still survives. And that's the most beautiful thing about this, the power that it survived all those years. Maybe 10,000 years or so. And they still do it today, but we've forgotten what it is. And I want to bring that back. I want to help bring it back, do a little part to it. And the reason, as I said at the start, for doing this video is because I'm going to be giving away some hammers. I'm paying postage. And I'll write a post about it where we'll be able to formally ask to do it. And all I ask is that you give the hammer in a votive offering. Somewhere local to you. If you want to take part in the beating of the bounds, as Odinist, Folkish Odinism Dorset do, where they're going to take 9 hammers and put them around their territory. Do it. I'll give you one. You can make your own. You can buy something else or do whatever you want. Yeah. I'll give you one to start it. Or if you just want to give a hammer to a local riverway, just somewhere special to you that you feel has power or importance, that something within there dwells that you can't quite explain. Like I say, all I'm going to ask is that it'd be a group. So even if you're not a formal group, make one. Why don't you make one? That'd be brilliant. If you've got a few friends in your local area that all have these ways, but you're not really a member of a group and you don't really know what to do, make a group. And I'll send you a hammer. And all I ask is that you take a few photos. And even if you don't want me to promote those photos, because I can understand some people might not want to be associated because I'm an open folkish heathen and that gets some stick in the modern times. As long as you promote it on your page or promote it somewhere to try and encourage others to do it. That's all I ask for my gift to you for there. And I would be honoured to give these hammers. To know that somewhere my hammers are going in appreciation of the land. And if in any small way me and Folkish Odinism Dorset can encourage other people to do this ancient practice, that's an honour too. So I hope you enjoyed the stream tonight, guys. And like I said, there will be articles posted about this, both from Folkish Odinism Dorset. I'm going to put on my website and link back, and I will recommend everybody checks that out. And I will post an article about a bit more technically about it too, about how I'm going to give these out and how to get one for your group very soon. I'm going to leave with a video of Boudica and the Great Talks, as it's appropriate to some of the things we've talked about. And I'll see you, well, it'll be a month now, but you'll see me anyway, because we'll get some of those questions. I'll get a post up tomorrow and we'll try and get some questions. I'll try and make a few little videos where I'm just sitting here, maybe with a few images that we can try and get more weekly footage out whilst we wait for the more poetic videos. So thank you for joining me tonight. I really do appreciate it. No point doing it if you're not watching. Thanks if you're watching back. We will leave this one up on YouTube. But the ones that are not on YouTube, you can find them all over at our Libri or BitChute channel. So please check those out and subscribe to those. It helps us greatly to get more numbers everywhere because it helps us in algorithms get these videos out. So thanks for joining me and good night. In stature she was very tall, in appearance most terrifying, the glance of her eye most fierce, and her voice was harsh. A great mass of the tawniest hair fell to her hips. Around her neck was a large golden necklace, and she wore a tunic of diverse colours, over which a thick mantle was fastened with a brooch. This description of the mighty warrior Queen Boudica by Cassius Dio conjures an impressive image. an image that has inspired artists and ignited heroic imaginations for nearly 2,000 years. Although much is left to our imaginations when trying to picture images from our ancient past like that of Boudicca's, because of archaeological finds, some things are easier than others. Take, for example, the golden necklace that Cassius describes adorning Boudicca's neck. This must be a description of a Celtic torque, and luckily for us, 175 torques were found in a field that 2,000 years ago was well within the territory of the proud Iceni. The most spectacular find was what is known as the Snettisham Great Torque. Although the dating puts it about 100 years too early to be the one Boudica wore, it gives us a great example of the one she did. The Snettisham Great Torque consists of 64 intricately woven golden threads. 8 small threads were entwined to make 8 larger ones, that are again weaved to make the final piece. The terminals were cast using the lost wax method, either directly on the piece or separately, and welded on later to complete this masterpiece of Iron Age metalworking. Weighing over 2 kilograms, this majestic work of art would have belonged to someone of great renown and fame. Given that there is only about 100 years between the burial of the piece and Boudica's uprising, the powerful figure that once owned it would almost certainly have been known to her from legend, and even possibly one of her ancestors. The Great Torque's timeless beauty is for me perfectly mirrored by the timeless nature of Boudica's struggle. Both speak through the ages to the true nature of ourselves and the world we dwell in. Boudica's defiance shows the immortal nature of our desire for freedom, whilst the Torque perfectly encapsulates our inner beauty, made manifest. And once again, we see our forebears, not as primitive barbarians, eking out an existence on the edge of the world, but as enlightened philosophers of the internal and external beauty of man.
How about you get it tatted on